There is a bell in Philadelphia that cannot ring, that sits silent and still behind protective glass, that is visited by millions of people each year who come to see not a functioning instrument, but a broken one, not a perfect symbol, but a flawed one, not a bell that proclaims freedom through sound, but one that speaks of freedom through silence, through its very inability to perform the function for which it was created. The Liberty Bell is perhaps the most famous bell in the world, is recognized instantly by its shape and by the crack that runs across its surface, that zigzags through the bronze like a lightning bolt frozen in metal, that renders the bell useless for its original purpose, but somehow makes it more powerful as a symbol, more meaningful as a representation of ideals that are themselves imperfect, themselves subject to cracking and breaking and needing constant repair and attention. The crack is what makes the Liberty Bell the Liberty Bell. Without it, the bell would be just another 18th century bronze bell, large and well cast perhaps, inscribed with an interesting biblical quotation certainly, but not fundamentally different from hundreds of other bells that hang in churches and public buildings and remain functional, remain able to ring, remain ordinary despite their age and their craftsmanship. It is the crack that elevates this particular bell above all others, that makes it instantly recognizable, that transforms it from object into icon, from functioning instrument into symbol that resonates precisely because it is broken, because it cannot do what bells are meant to do, because its silence speaks louder than any sound it might have made, because its imperfection makes it perfect as a representation of democracy and freedom and the American experiment, all of which are themselves cracked and imperfect, all of which require constant work to prevent from breaking further, all of which endure despite their flaws, perhaps even because of them. But the crack is also a mystery. When did it appear? How did it happen? Was it a single catastrophic event or a gradual process? Was it the result of a flaw in the original casting, or was it caused by how the bell was used, by being rung too hard or too often, or in ways that stressed the metal beyond its capacity? Different sources give different answers, different dates, different explanations. The bell's history is layered with myth and legend, with stories that have become repeated so often that they have taken on the weight of truth even when evidence contradicts them, with patriotic narratives that emphasize certain aspects while ignoring others, with simplifications that make good stories but poor history. To understand the Liberty Bell and its crack, we must trace the bell's history from the beginning, must follow it from its casting in London in 1751, through its journey to Philadelphia, through its early crackings and recastings, through its service as the Pennsylvania State House bell, through its association with the American Revolution and with the abolition of slavery, through its transformation from working bell to treasured relic, through its travels across America and its eventual installation in its current home, through all the moments and decisions and accidents that made it what it is today, not just a bell, not just a historical artifact, but a symbol that carries meanings beyond itself, that represents ideas larger than its physical form, that speaks to something deep in American identity and in the human understanding of freedom and justice and the ongoing struggle to achieve them. Let us begin not in Philadelphia, but in London, in the Whitechapel district, in a bell foundry that had been operating since 1570, that had cast bells for churches and institutions across England and increasingly across the British colonies,
that had developed expertise in the complex art of bell founding, that understood the metallurgy and the acoustics and the craftsmanship required to create bells that would ring true, that would endure, that would serve their purposes for generations or even centuries. It is here, in 1751, that our story truly begins, with an order from the Pennsylvania Assembly for a bell to hang in their state house, a bell that would summon legislators to sessions, that would mark important occasions, that would serve as the voice of colonial government in Philadelphia. The Assembly was building a new state house, what we now call Independence Hall, and they wanted a bell worthy of the structure, a bell that would be heard across the city, that would announce the importance of what transpired within the building's walls, that would be, in a sense, the voice of Pennsylvania's colonial government. They ordered a bell weighing about 2,000 pounds to be inscribed with a quotation from Leviticus in the Bible: "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." This inscription was chosen to commemorate the 50th anniversary of William Penn's Charter of Privileges, Pennsylvania's Constitution, which guaranteed certain rights and freedoms to the colony's inhabitants. The biblical passage from Leviticus 25:10 refers to the year of Jubilee, when debts were forgiven and slaves were freed, making it particularly appropriate for a bell intended to mark an anniversary of political liberty. The Whitechapel Bell Foundry accepted the commission, began the process of creating the bell according to the Assembly's specifications. Bell founding in the 18th century was an art as much as a science, required experience and skill that were passed down through generations, required understanding of how molten metal behaved, how it cooled, how the shape of the mold affected the final sound, how thickness and curvature and material composition all contributed to creating a bell that would ring true, that would endure, that would serve their purposes for generations or even centuries. The bell was completed, was inscribed with the biblical quotation, along with additional text identifying it as cast for the Pennsylvania Assembly, was prepared for shipment across the Atlantic. The journey by sea was not without risk. Storms could damage cargo, ships could sink, months could pass before the bell arrived in Philadelphia. But the bell made the crossing successfully, arrived in Philadelphia in late summer or early fall of 1752, was unloaded at the docks, was transported to the State House, was examined by the Assembly and by the workers who would install it in the tower. Everything appeared satisfactory. The bell was well cast, properly inscribed, appropriately sized. Preparations were made to hang it, to test it, to begin using it for its intended purposes.
And then they rang it, the first test, the first strike of the clapper against the bronze, and the bell cracked. Not catastrophically, not shattering into pieces, but cracking nonetheless, developing a fracture that rendered it unsuitable for use, that created a sound that was wrong, that demonstrated conclusively that something was wrong with the bell, that it would not serve, that it had failed almost immediately upon arrival. The disappointment must have been profound. After waiting months for the bell, after the expense of commissioning and shipping it from England, after the anticipation of finally having a proper bell for the State House, to have it crack on the very first test, this was disaster, was failure, was a problem that needed to be solved. What had gone wrong? Was the bell poorly cast, flawed from the beginning? Was the metal composition incorrect, the tin ratio wrong, the bronze too brittle? Was the bell damaged in transit, weakened by the ocean crossing, cracked internally in ways that only became apparent when force was applied? Or was the problem with how it was rung, with the clapper being too heavy or striking with too much force, with installation issues that stressed the bell in ways it wasn't designed to withstand? The answers were unclear then and remain somewhat uncertain now, though metallurgical analysis and historical research have provided insights into what likely occurred.
The immediate response was practical rather than analytical. The assembly needed a bell, and they had a broken one. Should they send it back to England, demand a replacement, wait another year or more for a new bell to be cast and shipped from England? Or should they attempt to repair it locally, find founders in Philadelphia who could recast the bell, who could salvage the bronze and create a new bell from it? They chose the latter option, perhaps because it was faster, perhaps because sending the bell back seemed too expensive and uncertain, perhaps because there was local pride involved, a desire to show that Philadelphia craftsmen could handle such work, could solve the problem without needing to rely on English expertise. The task fell to John Pass and John Stowe, local founders who had a furnace and the capability to work with bronze, who agreed to take on the challenge of recasting the bell, of melting it down and creating a new one that would, they hoped, avoid whatever flaw had caused the original to crack. Pass and Stowe were not bell founders by specialty. Their main business was other types of metalwork, but they had the facilities and the confidence to attempt the recasting, and they brought to the project their own theories about what had gone wrong and how to fix it. Their primary intervention was to add more copper to the bronze, reducing the proportion of tin, making the alloy less brittle and, they believed, less likely to crack. This was not unreasonable metallurgy. Making the bronze softer would make it tougher, would make it better able to withstand impacts from the clapper without fracturing. But it would also change the tone of the bell, would make it sound different from how the Whitechapel founders had intended, would sacrifice some acoustic quality in favor of durability. Pass and Stowe melted down the original bell, added the additional copper, cast a new bell from the modified alloy, allowed it to cool, and presented it to the assembly for testing. The new bell didn't crack. It rang without fracturing, demonstrated that it could withstand the impact of the clapper, proved itself durable in that fundamental sense. But it sounded terrible. The tone was wrong, was harsh and unmusical, was described by contemporaries as unbearable, as unsuitable for a public building, as an embarrassment rather than an improvement. The assembly was not pleased. They had a bell that wouldn't crack but also wouldn't produce an acceptable sound, that would work functionally but would fail aesthetically, that would be worse in daily use than the original had been in that single test ring before it cracked. Pass and Stowe, to their credit, didn't give up. They offered to try again, to recast once more, to adjust the composition, to try to find a middle ground between durability and tone quality. The assembly, with limited alternatives, agreed. Pass and Stowe melted the bell again, made new calculations about alloy composition, cast a new third version of the bell. This time, the result was more acceptable. The tone was not perfect. Contemporaries noted that it didn't sound as good as English bells, but it was adequate, was tolerable, was something the assembly could live with. More importantly, it didn't crack. It could be rung repeatedly without failing, could serve the purposes for which it was intended, could function as the State House bell, even if it wouldn't win any prizes for its musical qualities. This third version of the bell, cast by Pass and Stowe in 1753, is the Liberty Bell we know today. It served as the Pennsylvania State House bell for decades, rang to summon the colonial assembly, marked important occasions, became a familiar sound in Philadelphia, integrated itself into the daily rhythm of the city. It was not particularly famous, not especially notable, was simply the State House bell, one piece of infrastructure among many, functional if not perfect, ordinary despite the interesting biblical inscription, just another bell doing its job in a colonial city that was growing and prospering but had not yet become central to world history. The bell rang for more than 20 years without incident, served through the growing tensions between the colonies and Britain, rang as political crises developed, as resistance to British policies intensified, as Philadelphia became increasingly important as a center of colonial coordination and eventually of revolutionary activity. And here we encounter one of the most persistent myths about the Liberty Bell, one that has been repeated in countless retellings, one that has shaped how Americans understand the bell and its significance, one that is almost certainly false, but which continues to be believed and propagated despite historical evidence to the contrary. The myth is this: On July 4, 1776, when the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, the State House bell rang out to announce the news to the city, to proclaim liberty, to mark the birth of a new nation, to connect the biblical inscription, "Proclaim Liberty," with the actual proclamation of American independence. The image is powerful, the bell ringing on that historic day, its sound carrying across Philadelphia, its inscription suddenly taking on new and profound meaning, becoming prophecy fulfilled, becoming the Liberty Bell in that very moment through its association with the Declaration.
But it almost certainly didn't happen that way. The Declaration was not publicly proclaimed on July 4th. That date marks when Congress adopted the text, when the document was finalized. But the public reading, the moment when ordinary citizens first heard the Declaration, came later, on July 8th, when the document was read aloud from a platform in the State House yard. If the bell rang to mark any announcement of independence, it would have been then, on the 8th, not on the 4th. Moreover, the bell tower was in disrepair in 1776, may not have been structurally sound enough to support ringing the bell, may have required the bell to be removed, or at least not used. Contemporary accounts don't mention the bell ringing on either the 4th or the 8th. This is telling silence, suggests that if the bell had rung to mark such a momentous occasion, someone would have noted it, would have mentioned it in letters or diaries or newspapers. The association between the bell and the Declaration seems to have developed later, seems to be a creation of the 19th century, when the bell was being transformed from ordinary object into sacred relic, when stories about the Revolution were being elaborated and embellished, when patriotic narratives were more important than historical accuracy. When the bell needed an origin story that connected it to the founding of the nation, that gave it revolutionary credentials, that justified its emerging status as a national symbol. The story of the bell ringing on July 4th served these purposes perfectly, created a clear and emotionally resonant connection between the bell and independence, and so the story was told and retold until it became fact in popular understanding, until it appeared in textbooks and paintings and sculptures, until it became part of the bell's identity, even though it likely never happened. This doesn't mean the bell was irrelevant during the Revolution, doesn't mean it played no role in those momentous years. The bell did ring during the revolutionary period, did mark various events, did serve, as it always had, as the voice of the State House. But its specific connection to the Declaration is almost certainly myth, is a story that tells us more about 19th century America and its need for symbols than about what actually happened in 1776. What we do know is that when the British occupied Philadelphia in 1777, the city's bells were in danger of being seized and melted down for cannon. Bronze was valuable for military purposes, and bells were ready-made sources of the alloy, could be easily requisitioned and converted into artillery. To prevent this, many of Philadelphia's bells, including the State House bell, were removed from their towers and hidden. The State House bell was taken to Allentown, about 60 miles north of Philadelphia, was hidden in the basement of the Zion Reformed Church, remained there for about a year until the British evacuated Philadelphia and it was safe to return. This journey to Allentown and back is well documented, is one of the few episodes in the bell's revolutionary history that we can confirm with confidence. The bell survived the war intact, was not melted for cannons like so many other bells, was returned to the State House Tower, resumed its normal functions, continued to serve as it had before, ordinary and unremarkable, except for having survived a period when its very existence was threatened, when it came close to being destroyed for military purposes, but was saved through foresight and effort. After the Revolution, after the Constitution was ratified and the new government was established, after Philadelphia served its period as the nation's capital and then lost that status to Washington, the State House bell continued its service, rang for various occasions, marked presidential visits and important announcements, served the state of Pennsylvania as Pennsylvania's government continued to use the building. The bell was not yet the Liberty Bell. That name would come later,
would be attached as the bell's symbolic significance grew, as it became associated not just with the revolution, but with broader struggles for freedom, with movements that sought to expand liberty beyond what the founders had envisioned, beyond the limited conception of freedom that existed in the late 18th century. The key transformation in the bell's significance came through the abolitionist movement. In the decades before the Civil War, as the struggle over slavery intensified, as abolitionists sought symbols and language that would resonate with American ideals, they seized upon the State House bell and its inscription as a powerful tool for their cause. "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." These words took on new meaning when applied to the question of slavery, when used to argue that liberty should indeed be proclaimed to all inhabitants, including the millions held in bondage in the southern states, including those whom the nation's founding documents had excluded from the promises they proclaimed. The abolitionists began calling it the Liberty Bell, using it in their literature, invoking it in their speeches, creating an association between the bell and the cause of ending slavery. This was brilliant rhetoric, connected their contemporary struggle to the revolutionary past, suggested that abolition was the fulfillment of the revolution's promises rather than a radical departure from them, used the bell's own inscription to argue that America was not living up to its stated ideals, that liberty was proclaimed but not delivered to all inhabitants, that the work of the revolution was incomplete and would remain so as long as slavery existed. This is when the bell truly became the Liberty Bell, when it acquired the name it carries today, when it was transformed from a piece of state property into a national symbol, from a functional object into an icon of freedom. And ironically, this transformation occurred around the same time that the bell cracked, that it ceased to be functional, that it became unable to ring, that it was rendered silent. But when exactly did the crack appear? This question has been debated for more than a century and a half, has generated various theories and conflicting accounts, has never been definitively resolved despite extensive research and despite the examination of the bell by metallurgists and historians. What we know for certain is that the bell was cracked by the mid-19th century, was damaged severely enough that it could no longer be rung with risk of the crack spreading further, was relegated to display rather than use. What we don't know with certainty is when this happened, under what circumstances, whether it was a sudden event or a gradual process.
The most commonly cited date is February 22, 1846, Washington's birthday, a major civic holiday in 19th century America. According to tradition, the bell was being rung to mark the birthday of the nation's first president, was struck enthusiastically and repeatedly, and during this celebration, the crack appeared, spread across the bell, rendered it unsuitable for further use. The story is dramatic, connects the final cracking to a patriotic occasion, provides a specific moment when the bell's functional life ended, when it transitioned from working instrument to preserved relic. But like many stories about the Liberty Bell, this one may be more legend than fact, maybe a creation of later years, a story that provided explanation and closure, that gave meaning to the crack by connecting it to a significant date. Contemporary accounts from 1846 don't consistently support this story, don't provide clear evidence that the crack appeared on that specific day, suggest instead that the crack may have developed gradually, may have been present in some form before 1846, may have been worsened by ringing, but not necessarily caused by a single event on Washington's birthday. What metallurgical analysis can tell us is that the crack developed along lines of weakness in the bronze, that it follows patterns consistent with metal fatigue, with stress accumulation over time rather than with sudden catastrophic failure. The crack is not the result of a single blow, but of repeated stress, of thousands or tens of thousands of ringings over decades, of metal being flexed and strained again and again until it finally failed, until the accumulated damage became too great to withstand further use.
This type of cracking is common in bells, is why bell founders pay such careful attention to composition and thickness and shape, is why bells, despite being designed specifically to be struck repeatedly, still eventually fail, still develop cracks that end their functional lives. The Liberty Bell's crack is particularly dramatic, is large and obvious, runs roughly from the crown down through the inscription, zigzags in a pattern that is instantly recognizable, that has become as much a part of the bell's identity as its shape or its text. The crack was wide enough to affect the bell's sound even before it was completely non-functional, created a discordant tone, made the bell sound wrong, ensured that even if ringing didn't worsen the damage, the result wouldn't be musically acceptable. By the 1840s, whether or not the dramatic Washington's birthday cracking actually occurred, the bell was certainly damaged enough that authorities decided it should no longer be rung regularly, that it should be preserved rather than used, that its symbolic value now outweighed its practical function. Attempts were made to arrest the crack's spread, to prevent further damage, to stabilize the bell so it could at least be displayed without risk of the crack continuing to grow. The technique used was called stop drilling, drilling holes at the ends of the crack to interrupt the stress lines, to create points where the crack would stop rather than continuing to propagate through the metal. This is a standard technique in metalwork, is used to repair cracks in various types of structures, works by changing how stress is distributed, by preventing the concentration of forces at the crack tip that drives further failure. Stop drilling was performed on the Liberty Bell. Holes were drilled at strategic points around the crack's path. Attempts were made to ensure the bell could be preserved indefinitely without further deterioration. These interventions were somewhat successful. The crack has not continued to grow significantly since these repairs were made, has remained relatively stable for more than 150 years. But the bell could not be restored to functional condition, could not be made to ring again without risk, was permanently consigned to display status, was transformed irreversibly from instrument to artifact, from working bell to preserved memorial. There were those who argued for more extensive repairs, who suggested that the bell should be recast, that the bronze could be melted down and a new bell created that would be identical except for being whole, except for being able to ring, except for being functional rather than broken. But these proposals were rejected, were seen as destroying the bell rather than preserving it, as eliminating what made it significant rather than maintaining that significance. The crack had become essential, had become part of the bell's meaning, had become inseparable from its identity as a symbol. To remove the crack would be to destroy the Liberty Bell, to create something new rather than preserving something historic, to choose functionality over authenticity, to prioritize what the bell could do over what it was. And so the bell remained cracked, remained broken, remained unable to ring. And in remaining broken, it became more powerful as a symbol, became more meaningful as a representation of American ideals, became more eloquent in its silence than it had ever been in sound. The cracked Liberty Bell became the Liberty Bell we know, the bell whose image appears in countless souvenirs and in countless photographs, the bell that millions of people have visited and will continue to visit, the bell that speaks precisely through its inability to speak, that proclaims liberty precisely through its silence, that represents the endurance of ideals precisely through its physical failure, through the crack that runs across its surface and that has become, paradoxically, what makes it perfect as a symbol of imperfect democracy, of freedom that is flawed but enduring, of promises that are cracked but not broken, of a nation that, like the bell, remains whole despite its visible damage, that continues to exist and to matter despite its imperfections, despite the obvious and undeniable cracks that run through its history and its present. The Liberty Bell in the late 19th and early 20th centuries became not just a symbol, but a traveler, became an object that was moved around the country, that was displayed at various expositions and celebrations, that was sent on railroad journeys so that Americans who could never come to Philadelphia could see it in their own cities, could experience directly this piece of American heritage, could stand before the physical object and feel connection to the nation's history and to the ideals it represented.
These journeys began in 1885 when the bell was sent to New Orleans for the World's Cotton Exposition, was loaded onto a railroad car, was transported hundreds of miles from Philadelphia, was displayed to crowds who gathered to see it, who touched it, this was still allowed at the time, who took pieces of it as souvenirs when guards weren't watching. The practice of chipping off small pieces of the bell became a problem, required increased security, eventually contributed to the decision to encase the bell in protective barriers to prevent direct contact that was gradually destroying it, that was removing material piece by tiny piece, that threatened to erode the bell through accumulated small thefts, even though no single piece taken was significant. After New Orleans, the bell traveled to other expositions, to Chicago for the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, to Atlanta, to Charleston, to Boston for the Bunker Hill celebration. Each journey was controversial, generated debates about whether the bell should be moved, whether the risk of damage outweighed the benefit of allowing more people to see it, whether the bell belonged in Philadelphia or belonged to the entire nation, whether it should be preserved in place or should be shared despite the risks that entailed. The most ambitious journey came in 1915 when the bell was sent to San Francisco for the Panama Pacific International Exposition, was transported across the entire continent, traveled through multiple states, stopped in cities along the way so that people could see it, spent months away from Philadelphia, covered thousands of miles, demonstrated the nation's affection for the bell, showed how deeply the Liberty Bell had become embedded in American consciousness, how much it meant not just to Philadelphians, but to all Americans who saw in it a representation of their shared history and their shared commitment to freedom. But these journeys also raised concerns about the bell's fragility, about whether all this movement was causing additional damage, whether the crack was spreading, whether the bell would survive repeated transport, whether the desire to share it was actually destroying it. After the San Francisco journey, the decision was made that the bell would travel no more, that it would remain in Philadelphia, that people would have to come to it rather than it going to them, that preservation was more important than accessibility, that the bell needed to be protected, even if that meant fewer people would see it, even if that meant it would not be shared as widely as some would prefer. The bell returned to Philadelphia in 1915 and has not left since, has remained in various locations in or near Independence Hall, has been displayed in different configurations, has been subject to changing ideas about how historic objects should be presented, about what kind of context should be provided, about how to balance reverence for the object with historical accuracy about its significance and its limitations. For much of the 20th century, the bell was displayed in Independence Hall itself, was inside the building where it had originally hung, was part of the complex of historic structures associated with the founding of the nation. But as visitation increased, as millions of people came to Philadelphia to see the bell, as security concerns intensified, as the desire to provide better interpretive information became more pressing, the decision was made to create a dedicated facility for displaying the bell, a purpose-built structure that could accommodate large numbers of visitors, that could provide climate control and security, that could offer context and interpretation, that could present the bell not just as an object to be viewed, but as a teaching tool, as a way to engage with complex questions about American history and American identity, about the relationship between ideals and reality, about the ongoing struggle to make real the promises proclaimed in the Declaration and symbolized by the bell. The Liberty Bell Center opened in 2003, cost more than $10 million, created a space designed specifically around the bell and its presentation, included exhibits about the bell's history, about its use by various social movements, about the disparity between the inscription's promise of liberty and the reality of slavery and later segregation, about the complex and often contradictory nature of American history, about how the same symbol can mean different things to different people, can be claimed by various causes, can represent both achievement and aspiration, both what has been accomplished and what remains to be done. Security around the bell is tight, reflects both the general increase in security concerns at historic sites and the specific importance of the Liberty Bell as a national symbol, as a potential target, as an object that must be protected not just from accidental damage, but from deliberate destruction, from those who might seek to harm it as a way of harming what it represents, of striking symbolically at American identity and American ideals. The bell cannot be touched, cannot be accessed directly, exists behind barriers both physical and electronic, is monitored constantly, is protected in ways that earlier generations would not have imagined necessary, but which current circumstances demand. The crack is monitored as well, is regularly examined to ensure it is not growing, is subject to periodic analysis, is understood now in ways it could not have been understood in the 19th century, is recognized as a particular type of fatigue failure, as the result of specific metallurgical properties interacting with specific stress patterns, as something that can be explained scientifically even if the exact moment of its appearance remains historically uncertain. Modern technology allows conservators to track the bell's condition with precision, to detect any changes in the crack's dimensions, to monitor environmental conditions that might affect the bronze, to ensure that the bell is preserved as carefully as possible, that future generations will inherit it in condition as close as possible to how it exists now.
The decision has been made, definitively and apparently permanently, that the crack will not be repaired, that the bell will not be restored to functional condition, that it will remain cracked, will remain silent, will continue to speak through its inability to ring. This decision reflects both practical conservation philosophy, preserving objects as they are rather than as they might have been, maintaining authenticity even when that means maintaining damage, and symbolic understanding that the crack has become essential to meaning, that the Liberty Bell without its crack would not be the Liberty Bell, would be something different, would lose much of its power as symbol, would become just another old bell, rather than the specific object that has come to mean so much to so many people. The science of bells and their cracking deserves deeper examination, helps us understand not just what happened to the Liberty Bell, but why it happened, why bells crack at all, what makes some bells durable and others fragile, what the Liberty Bell's founders, both in London and in Philadelphia, would have known and what they couldn't have known, what choices they made that may have contributed to the eventual cracking, and what was simply inevitable given the materials and techniques available to them. Bronze, the material from which bells are cast, is an alloy primarily of copper and tin, though other elements may be present in small quantities. The proportions matter enormously. Change the tin content by a few percentage points, and the bronze's properties change significantly. Traditional bell metal uses roughly 20 to 25% tin, with the remainder copper. This high tin content makes the bronze hard and brittle compared to bronze used for other purposes, makes it able to produce the clear, sustained tones that bells require, makes it respond properly to being struck, makes it vibrate in ways that create sound rather than absorbing impact. But that brittleness is also a vulnerability. Hard materials crack more easily than soft ones, resist deformation, but fail suddenly when stress exceeds their limits. A bell is designed to vibrate when struck, is meant to flex slightly, is intended to store energy in its deformation and release that energy as sound. But repeated flexing, repeated stress causes fatigue, creates microscopic damage that accumulates over time, eventually leads to crack formation and propagation. All bells will eventually fail this way, given enough ringing, given enough years of service. The question is not whether, but when. Not if, but after how many ringings, after how many years.
The Liberty Bell's metallurgy has been analyzed multiple times, has been subject to modern scientific examination, has had samples removed, tiny amounts for testing purposes, and examined to determine exact composition. What these analyses have revealed is that the bell's bronze is not quite standard, is higher in copper and lower in tin than optimal bell metal, reflects the modifications that Pass and Stowe made when they recast the bell, when they added copper to prevent cracking, when they sacrificed some acoustic quality for durability. Ironically, this modification may have contributed to the eventual cracking rather than preventing it. The lower tin content would make the bronze softer, would make it less likely to crack from a single strong impact, would make it more forgiving of abuse. But that also makes it less resilient to repeated stress, would make it more subject to fatigue failure, would mean that the accumulated effect of thousands of ringings would be more damaging than it would be in properly proportioned bell metal. The attempt to prevent cracking by softening the bronze may have actually ensured cracking, may have traded immediate durability for long-term fragility, may have created a bell that wouldn't fail dramatically, but would fail eventually, would wear out rather than breaking suddenly. This is speculation. We cannot know for certain what would have happened if Pass and Stowe had used different proportions, cannot rerun the experiment with altered variables, cannot determine definitively whether their metallurgical intervention helped or hurt. What we know is that the bell they created served for nearly a century before the major crack appeared, rang thousands of times, fulfilled its function for generations, provided good service despite its non-optimal composition, despite the compromises made in its recasting. Whether it would have lasted longer with different metallurgy, whether the Whitechapel original would have proven more durable if it had been rehung rather than recast, whether the entire history might have been different with different choices at various points, these are unanswerable questions, are counterfactuals that can never be tested, are interesting to consider, but impossible to resolve. What matters is what actually happened. The bell was cast, cracked immediately, recast twice, served for many decades, cracked again, was preserved rather than repaired, became symbol rather than remaining instrument, means what it means now rather than what it might have meant under different circumstances. The crack exists, is real, is the defining characteristic of the Liberty Bell, is what transforms it from object to icon, from physical thing to symbolic meaning, from functional instrument to silent witness, from brass and bronze to something approaching the sacred, to an object that transcends its material nature and becomes invested with significance that goes far beyond what any collection of copper and tin atoms, regardless of how they're arranged, could intrinsically possess. The crack has become, in a very real sense, more important than the bell itself, has become what people come to see, what they photograph, what they remember. Ask someone to describe the Liberty Bell and they will mention the crack, will note its size and shape and prominence, will understand that the crack is not incidental but essential, not a regrettable defect but a crucial feature, not something to be overlooked but something to be focused on, to be contemplated, to be understood as carrying meaning. But what meaning? What does the crack represent? Different people have answered this question differently, have found in the broken bell various lessons and various symbols, have used it to argue for different causes and different understandings of what America is and what it should be. For some, the crack represents the imperfection of democracy, the fact that the American experiment has always been flawed, has always failed to live up to its promises, has always been cracked by contradictions between ideals and reality, by the gap between what was proclaimed and what was practiced, by the fact that liberty was declared for all but delivered only to some, that the bell's inscription promised freedom to all inhabitants, but the nation that cherished that inscription also permitted slavery, also excluded women from political participation, also denied rights to those without property, also failed repeatedly to match deeds to words, actions to principles.
For others, the crack represents resilience, represents the fact that despite being broken, the bell endures, that despite being damaged, it remains, that imperfection does not mean failure, that something can be flawed and still be valuable.
that cracks do not necessarily lead to complete collapse, that what is broken can still function symbolically, even when it cannot function practically. The bell doesn't ring, but it speaks, doesn't proclaim liberty through sound, but proclaims it through presence, through persistence, through the fact that despite the crack, it remains whole, remains recognizable, remains able to carry meaning and to inspire and to represent ideas that matter to people even when, especially when, those people recognize that the ideas are imperfectly realized, that the promises are incompletely fulfilled, that the work remains ongoing. For still others, the crack is simply historical fact, is what happened, is the result of metallurgy and stress and time, is not symbolic but literal, not meaningful but physical, not a lesson but a phenomenon, something that can be explained through science rather than interpreted through philosophy, something that tells us about how bells work and why they fail, rather than about what America means or what freedom requires. This view sees the crack as interesting from a conservation perspective, as a problem to be managed, as damage to be arrested, as physical reality that exists independent of whatever meanings might be projected onto it, as bronze behaving as bronze behaves under particular conditions, as material following the laws of physics, regardless of what symbolic weight it carries, regardless of what people want it to mean. All of these interpretations coexist. All find support among those who study the bell or visit it or think about what it represents. The crack can be simultaneously physical fact and symbolic meaning, can be understood scientifically and philosophically, can carry lessons about metallurgy and about democracy, can be appreciated as historical accident and as meaningful metaphor. The bell is large enough, its significance great enough, its presence in American culture deep enough that it can accommodate multiple interpretations, can mean different things to different people, can serve various purposes, can be claimed by various causes while still maintaining some core identity that makes it recognizably the Liberty Bell, regardless of how its significance is understood or explained. The myths surrounding the Liberty Bell, the July 4th ringing, the Washington's birthday cracking, various other stories that have been told and retold until they have acquired the weight of truth, deserve final consideration, deserve examination not just as errors to be corrected, but as phenomena in themselves, as evidence of how symbols work, how stories develop, how history and memory interact, how what people want to believe shapes what they do believe, how emotional truth can become more powerful than factual truth, how narratives can persist even when evidence contradicts them, even when scholars debunk them, even when the historical record clearly shows they are false. The July 4th ringing story is perhaps the most persistent of these myths, appears in countless children's books and textbooks, has been depicted in art and recreated in pageants, has become part of how Americans understand the Declaration of Independence and its announcement, has created an association between the bell and that specific date that feels right, even though it is almost certainly wrong. Why does the myth persist? Partly because it is a good story, provides a clear and dramatic connection between the bell and the founding moment, creates an image of celebration and proclamation that satisfies our desire for symbols to be present at crucial moments, for objects to participate in history rather than just observing it, for the Liberty Bell to have earned its name through direct association with Liberty's Declaration rather than through later adoption by abolitionists. Partly also because correcting the myth feels petty, feels like diminishing the bell's significance, feels like privileging historical accuracy over emotional resonance, like saying that facts matter more than feelings, that what actually happened is more important than what makes a better story. There is resistance to demythologizing, resistance to stripping away the legends, resistance to saying that the bell's significance is constructed rather than inherent, that it became important through processes that had nothing to do with the revolution, that it was relatively ordinary until the 19th century transformed it into something extraordinary. People want to believe the myths because the myths create meaning, because they connect the object to events we care about, because they give the bell a pedigree that justifies our reverence for it, that makes our emotional investment seem reasonable rather than arbitrary. But historical accuracy matters not because it diminishes the bell, but because it actually reveals something more interesting than the myths, reveals a more complex story about how symbols are created and how they evolve.
about how meanings attach to objects through processes that are contingent and historical rather than inevitable, about how the Liberty Bell became the Liberty Bell through specific actions by specific people in specific contexts, through abolitionists claiming it for their cause, through the crack making it unable to ring and therefore making it precious in its vulnerability, through decisions about preservation and display, through the accumulated choices and accidents that made this particular bell matter in ways that other bells do not, that elevated it above all the other colonial-era bells that were cast and hung and rung and eventually either survived or didn't, either became scrap metal or became museum pieces, either remain anonymous or acquired their own local significance without achieving the national prominence that the Liberty Bell possesses. Understanding the real history makes the bell more interesting, not less, makes its significance more impressive rather than less meaningful, shows the work that goes into creating symbols, shows that reverence is earned through cultural process rather than being inherent in objects, shows that we choose what matters to us, that we invest things with meaning through attention and care and repeated affirmation, that the Liberty Bell is important because we have collectively decided it is important, because generations of Americans have visited it and valued it and used it as a symbol, because it has accumulated significance through being treated as significant, through being preserved and protected and displayed and discussed, through being made central to how we understand American identity and American ideals.
The crack in this understanding becomes both more and less than it appears. Less because it is simply damage, is simply what happens to bronze when it is stressed repeatedly, is simply physics and metallurgy, is not magical or mystical or mysterious, but is entirely explainable through material science. But more because it has been invested with meaning beyond its physical nature, because it has become symbolic of imperfection and resilience, because it has made the bell more powerful as symbol precisely by making it useless as instrument, because it has transformed the Liberty Bell from functional object into sacred relic, from working bell into preserved memorial, from something that proclaims liberty through sound into something that proclaims liberty through silence, through presence, through the fact that despite being cracked, it remains, despite being broken, it endures, despite being unable to ring, it speaks. Despite its imperfection, it represents ideals that are themselves imperfect, but nonetheless worth pursuing, worth defending, worth passing forward to future generations who will make their own meanings from it, who will find in its cracked bronze their own lessons about freedom and justice and the ongoing struggle to make real what has been proclaimed, to deliver what has been promised, to close the gap between the ideals we profess and the realities we live, to repair the cracks in our own democracy while recognizing that some cracks cannot be fully repaired, can only be accepted, can only be acknowledged as part of what we are, part of our history and our present, part of the bell and part of the nation, part of the imperfection that makes us human and that makes democracy possible, that makes freedom real rather than abstract, that makes the Liberty Bell not perfect but true, not whole but honest, not ringing but speaking still, proclaiming liberty not through sound but through silence, not through what it is but through what it represents, not through perfection but through persistence, not despite the crack but because of it. The conservation of the Liberty Bell in the 21st century represents a delicate balance between preservation and presentation, between protecting the physical object and allowing millions of people to experience it, between treating it as a fragile artifact and displaying it as a powerful symbol, between scientific analysis and reverential stewardship. The crack, which for so long was seen primarily as damage to be managed, has become in modern conservation philosophy an essential feature to be protected, a part of the bell's integrity rather than a compromise of it, something that must be preserved as carefully as the bell's shape or its inscription or its historical provenance. Modern monitoring of the crack employs technologies that would have seemed like science fiction even a few decades ago.
Laser scanning creates precise three-dimensional models of the bell's entire surface, capturing every irregularity, every trace of tool marks from its casting and recasting, every subtle variation in the crack's path and width. These digital models are compared over time, allowing conservators to detect changes measured in fractions of millimeters, to know with certainty whether the crack is stable or spreading, whether the stop drilling and other interventions have successfully arrested its growth, or whether new approaches might be needed to prevent further deterioration. The environmental conditions around the bell are monitored constantly: temperature, humidity, air quality, vibration from nearby traffic or construction, any factor that might affect the bronze's stability. Climate control systems maintain conditions within narrow ranges, preventing the kinds of fluctuations that cause metal to expand and contract, that create stresses that could worsen existing damage or create new cracks. Air filtration removes pollutants that could corrode the bronze's surface, that could accelerate deterioration, that could gradually destroy the bell through chemical attack, even as physical stability was maintained. This level of care is extraordinary, is usually reserved for the most precious and fragile artifacts, reflects the Liberty Bell's unique status in American culture, its position as something approaching a secular sacred object, something that must be preserved at almost any cost, because what would be lost if it were damaged or destroyed is not just a historical artifact, but a piece of collective identity, a symbol that carries meanings that transcend its physical form, but which nonetheless depend on that physical form for their power, for their authenticity, for their ability to move and inspire and connect people to ideals and to history. Yet, even as conservators work to preserve the bell's physical integrity, historians and educators work to complicate its symbolic meaning, to ensure that visitors understand not just the triumphant narratives traditionally associated with the bell, but also the darker and more complex aspects of American history that the bell has both witnessed and participated in, that it has both symbolized and contradicted. The Liberty Bell Center's exhibits address slavery directly, discuss the fact that the bell hung in a city that was a major center of the slave trade, that it rang in a state where slavery was legal for decades after the Revolution, that its inscription proclaimed liberty while millions remained in bondage, that the gap between the promise and the reality was not just philosophical abstraction, but lived experience for those who were enslaved, who heard the bell's inscription and must have experienced it as bitter irony rather than as inspiring ideal.
These exhibits discuss how abolitionists reclaimed the bell, how they used its inscription as an argument against slavery, how they transformed what might have been seen as hypocrisy into a call to action, how they made the bell speak not for what America was, but for what America should become, not as celebration of achieved freedom, but as indictment of freedom denied. This transformation of the bell's meaning is itself historically significant, is part of how symbols work in democratic societies, how they can be contested and reinterpreted, how they can be claimed by different groups for different purposes, how the same object can simultaneously represent establishment power and revolutionary challenge, can be both official symbol and tool of protest, can mean different things to different people while remaining recognizably the same object, carrying the same physical form and the same inscription even as its significance shifts and evolves. The exhibits also address more recent history, discuss how the civil rights movement invoked the Liberty Bell, how Martin Luther King Jr. and others used its symbolism in their speeches and their writings, how they connected their struggle to the earlier struggle against slavery, how they used the bell to argue for continuity between the abolitionists and the civil rights activists, to claim that both movements were working to fulfill the same promise, to proclaim liberty to all inhabitants, to make real what had been proclaimed but not delivered, to close gaps and repair cracks in American democracy, to make the nation live up to its stated ideals.
This use of the bell continues, is not just historical but ongoing, as various movements and causes invoke the Liberty Bell, use its image, quote its inscription, connect their specific struggles to the broader American narrative of expanding freedom and justice. The bell has become flexible enough as a symbol to accommodate these various uses, to be claimed by conservatives and progressives, by those celebrating American achievement and those critiquing American failures, by those who see the bell as representing what America is and those who see it as representing what America should be, by those focused on its presence and those focused on its cracks, by those who hear its silence as peace and those who hear it as accusation. This multiplicity of meanings is not a weakness but a strength, is what allows the bell to remain relevant, to continue to matter, to avoid becoming a purely historical curiosity or a dead symbol that commemorates a past no longer connected to present concerns. The Liberty Bell lives precisely because it can be reinterpreted, because each generation can find in it what they need, because it is both specific enough to be recognizable and vague enough to be adaptable, because it stands for freedom without specifying too precisely what freedom means or how it should be pursued or who should have it or what limits might be placed on it. It proclaims liberty but does not define it, allows each person or group or movement to fill in the definition, to make the bell speak to their particular concerns and their particular understanding of what liberty requires and what obstacles stand in its way. The crack serves this symbolic flexibility well, provides a physical feature that can be read in multiple ways, that can be seen as flaw or as badge of authenticity, as damage or as distinction, as evidence of failure or as mark of survival, as problem or perfection. Unlike the bell's shape or its inscription, which are relatively fixed in their meaning and their implications, the crack can be interpreted variously, can support different readings, can be the basis for different lessons, can be whatever each viewer needs it to be: warning or reassurance, accusation or comfort, reminder of fragility or evidence of resilience. This interpretive openness is powerful, is what allows the bell to continue to speak to diverse audiences, to remain meaningful across different contexts and different eras, to be simultaneously historical artifact and living symbol, to be both preserved object from the past and relevant presence in the present, to be both what it is physically, cracked bronze bell cast in the 18th century, and what it is symbolically, whatever we need it to be, whatever meaning we invest in it, whatever significance we derive from our encounter with it. The physical encounter itself matters, is part of why millions of people make the journey to Philadelphia, wait in line, pass through security, enter the Liberty Bell Center, and stand before the bell itself, rather than being satisfied with photographs or videos or virtual experiences. There is something about presence, about being in the physical proximity of the actual object, that creates meaning in ways that mediation cannot fully replicate, that produces effects that no amount of description or imagery can substitute for. Standing before the Liberty Bell, seeing the crack with your own eyes rather than through a camera lens, understanding the scale of the bell directly rather than through measurements or comparisons, experiencing it as a physical object occupying space in the same room you occupy, this creates a connection that is qualitatively different from any mediated experience. That is why people travel. That is what draws them to this particular bell rather than to any of the numerous replicas scattered around the country and around the world. Those replicas themselves are interesting, are evidence of the bell's symbolic power, of the desire to have physical representations of the Liberty Bell even where the actual bell cannot be, of the felt need for communities and institutions to connect themselves to what the bell represents by having their own version of it, by creating copies that reference the original, that participate in its symbolism even as they acknowledge their own derivative nature, their status as copies rather than as the authentic object. Some of these replicas are quite accurate, are careful reproductions that match the original's dimensions and proportions, that include the crack in its proper location and configuration, that attempt to create as exact a copy as possible given that they cannot replicate the original's history, its specific metallurgy, its patina of age, all the qualities that make the actual Liberty Bell unique and irreplaceable. Other replicas are more interpretive, are inspired by the Liberty Bell rather than being direct copies copies are bells that carry similar inscriptions or that reference the Liberty Bell's form while being distinct objects in their own right, that participate in the Liberty Bell's symbolism without claiming to be duplicates of it. The existence of these replicas raises interesting questions about authenticity and symbolic power, about whether a copy can carry the same meaning as an original, about what exactly makes the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia special, given that its symbolic significance derives not from unique physical properties. Any competent bell founder could create a bell of similar size and shape and inscription, but from its history, from its associations, from its status as the specific object that has been invested with meaning through centuries of attention and interpretation and use. If the symbolism is what matters, if the physical object is just a vessel for meaning, then why couldn't a perfect replica serve equally well? Why insist on seeing the original when copies exist that are physically nearly identical?
The answer seems to be that authenticity matters, even when we cannot rationally explain why it should, that original objects carry weight that copies cannot match, that there is something about knowing you are in the presence of the actual thing, the object that witnessed the events, that participated in the history, that existed in the times and places we are trying to connect with, that creates meaning and generates emotional response in ways that perfect copies simply do not. The Liberty Bell in Philadelphia is the Liberty Bell, not because of how it looks, but because of what it is. Not because of its form, but because of its history. Not because of its physical properties, but because of its authenticity, its status as the real thing, rather than as a simulation of the real thing. This insistence on authenticity, this privileging of originals over copies, may seem irrational in an age of mechanical reproduction, in a time when copies can be so exact that experts cannot distinguish them from originals without sophisticated analysis, when digital representations can capture every visible detail and can be experienced without the limitations and inconveniences of physical presence. But the insistence persists, is evident in the millions who visit the Liberty Bell, who stand in line and accept restrictions on how closely they can approach it, and submit to security screening, all to see the actual bell when they could see perfect replicas with none of the hassle, could examine photographs and videos that show details more clearly than can be seen from behind the protective barriers, could learn everything knowable about the bell without leaving their homes. They come anyway. Insist on presence, insist on seeing the real thing, demonstrate through their actions that authenticity matters, that symbolic power is enhanced by historical authenticity, that what we are connecting with when we stand before the Liberty Bell is not just the symbolism, but the object itself, the specific collection of atoms that has existed continuously since Pass and Stowe cast it in 1753, that has participated in history rather than just representing it, that is history rather than just being about history. The Liberty Bell's influence extends beyond tourism and beyond symbolism into the realm of material culture, of design, of how its form and its crack have been reproduced and referenced in countless contexts. The bell's silhouette appears on everything from official documents to commercial products, from government seals to consumer goods, from serious contexts where its symbolic weight is appropriate to trivial ones where it serves merely as recognizable American iconography, where its meaning is diluted or transformed or simply ignored in favor of its visual recognizability, its status as shorthand for America or for Philadelphia or for freedom conceived generically rather than specifically. The crack appears in these representations with varying degrees of accuracy, sometimes carefully rendered to match the actual crack's path and proportion, sometimes simplified or stylized, sometimes reduced to a simple line that suggests cracking without attempting to represent the Liberty Bell's specific damage, sometimes omitted entirely when the goal is to reference the bell's shape without necessarily invoking all its associations, without carrying all its symbolic weight, without engaging with questions about imperfection and meaning that the crack raises. These variations in representation reflect different purposes and different understandings of what the bell means and what aspects of it are essential to whatever message or meaning is being communicated through its use.
The Liberty Bell has appeared in literature, in poetry and prose, in works that use it as metaphor or symbol or setting, that connect it to themes of freedom and justice and American identity, that sometimes engage deeply with its complexities and contradictions, and sometimes use it more superficially as convenient American symbol, as recognizable reference point that can evoke certain feelings or associations without requiring detailed development or nuanced engagement. The bell has appeared in film and television, in documentary and fiction, in serious historical treatments and in casual references, in contexts that honor it and contexts that parody it, in uses that respect its symbolic weight and uses that appropriate it for purposes that have little to do with what the bell originally represented or what it has come to mean through its association with abolition and civil rights. This promiscuous use of the Liberty Bell's image and symbolism might be seen as diminishing it, as cheapening through overuse and through inappropriate use what should be kept sacred, or at least treated with reverence, as allowing the bell to be deployed in contexts that undermine its significance or that trade on its recognizability without engaging with its meaning. But it might also be seen as evidence of the bell's symbolic success, of its penetration into American culture so completely that it can be referenced and understood without explanation, that its shape alone carries meaning, that it has become part of the common visual vocabulary, part of the shared iconography that allows communication and connection across diverse contexts and audiences. The Liberty Bell's future is uncertain in detail, but seems secure in broad outline. The physical bell will be preserved as carefully as modern conservation science allows, will be monitored and protected, will be maintained in stable condition, will be passed forward to future generations in form as close to possible to how it exists now. The crack will not be repaired. This seems definitive, seems to have been decided permanently, seems to reflect consensus that the bell's value lies in its authentic condition, including its damage, that to repair it would be to destroy what makes it significant, that preservation means maintaining what is rather than restoring what was or creating what might be. The bell's symbolic significance will continue to evolve, will be shaped by future events and future movements, will be claimed by future causes, will be interpreted by future generations according to their needs and their understandings, will remain flexible enough to accommodate new meanings while retaining enough connection to its history and its established significance to remain recognizably the Liberty Bell, to remain connected to the ideals and struggles it has come to represent. The bell will continue to be visited, will continue to draw millions who want to see it, who want to stand in its presence, who want to experience directly what photographs and descriptions cannot fully convey. And the bell will continue to be studied, will continue to generate scholarship, will continue to be examined by historians and conservationists and metallurgists and cultural critics, will continue to raise questions about authenticity and symbolism and preservation, about how objects acquire meaning and how meanings change over time, about the relationship between physical artifacts and the ideas they represent, about why some objects become invested with significance while others do not, about what makes something symbolic rather than merely historical, sacred rather than simply old, meaningful rather than just preserved.
The Liberty Bell stands, or rather hangs, as one of the most successful symbols in American culture, has achieved status that few objects reach, has become more than artifact and more than icon, has become something approaching the numinous, the sacred, the object that carries weight beyond what its physical form or historical significance alone could justify, that speaks to something deep in how humans create meaning, how we invest objects with significance, how we use physical things to represent abstract ideas, how we connect past to present through preservation and interpretation and ritual observation, through the practices of pilgrimage and display that transform ordinary objects into extraordinary ones, that make a cracked bell matter in ways that no functional bell could match, that make silence more eloquent than sound, that make imperfection perfect, that make the Liberty Bell what it is, broken and whole, silent and speaking, damaged and enduring, cracked but not destroyed, imperfect but invaluable, unable to ring but nonetheless still, always proclaiming liberty throughout all the land.
The Liberty Bell's relationship to truth and myth reflects a broader pattern in how nations construct their identity, how they create narratives that serve present needs even when those narratives conflict with historical evidence, how they choose which facts to emphasize and which to downplay or ignore, how they transform ordinary objects and events into sacred moments and symbols through processes that are more emotional than rational, more about meaning-making than about accurate historical representation. The bell has been mythologized not because anyone was deliberately lying or trying to deceive, but because the myths serve purposes that bare facts cannot serve, because stories need heroes and dramatic moments and clear connections between symbols and the ideals they represent, because the truth is often messy and complicated and doesn't provide the narrative clarity that commemoration and education and inspiration require. The persistence of the July 4th myth is instructive in this regard, even as historians have repeatedly demonstrated that the bell almost certainly did not ring on July 4, 1776, even as this correction has appeared in scholarly works and museum exhibits and educational materials. The myth continues to circulate, continues to appear in popular accounts, continues to be believed by millions who have never encountered or who have dismissed the historical evidence that contradicts it. This persistence is not simply ignorance or stubborn refusal to accept facts. It is evidence of how deeply embedded the myth has become in American cultural consciousness, how much it serves the function of creating a clear and emotionally resonant connection between the Liberty Bell and the founding moment, how difficult it is to dislodge a story that feels right even when evidence shows it is wrong. The myth creates a scene that we can visualize, the bell ringing out across Philadelphia, announcing independence, the sound carrying the news to citizens who had been waiting anxiously for the decision, creating a sonic marker of the moment when America became America, when colonies became nation, when subjects became citizens. This scene satisfies narrative requirements that the actual historical record does not. The truth that the Declaration was adopted on the 4th but publicly proclaimed on the 8th, that the bell may or may not have rung on the 8th, that the bell tower may have been in disrepair, this truth is unsatisfactory, is ambiguous, is unclear, does not provide the dramatic moment that the myth provides, does not create the clear connection between object and event that makes the bell seem essential to the founding rather than merely present for it. The same pattern appears with Washington's birthday cracking story. Whether or not the bell actually cracked on February 22, 1946, whether the crack appeared suddenly or developed gradually, whether ringing on that specific day caused or worsened the damage, these questions matter to historians, but matter less to the broader public, to those who want a clear story about when and how and why the crack appeared, who want the crack to have a specific moment of origin rather than being the result of gradual processes, who want the final ringing to have been on a significant date rather than on some random Tuesday for some unmemorable purpose. Washington's birthday provides that significant date, connects the crack to patriotic celebration, makes the bell's final functional moment coincide with commemoration of the first president, creates narrative symmetry and thematic resonance, even if the historical evidence for the story is thin. These myths reveal what people want from their symbols, what they need the Liberty Bell to be and to have done. They want it to have been present at the founding, want it to have participated actively in proclaiming independence rather than just happening to exist at that time. They want its crack to have meaning, to have occurred at a significant moment rather than through random accumulated stress, to mark an ending that is itself significant rather than arbitrary. They want the bell's story to be clear and dramatic and memorable, to be the kind of story that can be told to children and that will inspire them, that will create emotional connection to American history and American ideals, that will serve educational and civic purposes, even if it sacrifices historical accuracy.
This tension between historical truth and meaningful narrative is not unique to the Liberty Bell, appears throughout how nations remember their pasts, how they construct usable histories that serve present purposes,
how they create founding myths and heroic narratives and simplified accounts that make complex historical processes comprehensible and inspiring. Every nation does this. Every culture selects and emphasizes and interprets its history in ways that serve contemporary needs, that create desired meanings, that support particular understandings of national identity and national purpose. The Liberty Bell's myths are American versions of a universal process, are specific instances of how symbols are created and maintained, how they are invested with significance that may not derive directly from historical fact, but which is nonetheless real in its effects, real in how it shapes perception and emotion and action. The question is not whether myths should exist. They will exist regardless of whether historians approve, will emerge from the human need for meaning and for narrative clarity, will serve purposes that facts alone cannot serve. The question is how to engage with myths productively, how to acknowledge their power while also maintaining commitment to historical truth, how to teach both the myths and the evidence that contradicts them, how to explain why myths persist while also explaining what actually happened, how to honor the emotional and symbolic significance of objects like the Liberty Bell while also being honest about their actual history, about the gaps between legend and fact, about the constructed nature of their symbolic meaning. The Liberty Bell Center attempts this balance, presents both the traditional narratives and the historical complications, acknowledges what the bell has meant to various movements and causes while also questioning some of those meanings, celebrating the bell while also contextualizing it, treating it as precious while also subjecting it to critical analysis. This approach is not entirely satisfying to anyone. Those who want uncomplicated celebration feel that the complications diminish the bell's significance, while those who want thorough critical analysis feel that the celebration compromises scholarly integrity. But this uncomfortable middle ground may be the appropriate stance toward powerful symbols, may be the only honest way to engage with objects that carry such weight of meaning and such burden of myth, that are simultaneously historical artifacts deserving accurate interpretation and sacred symbols deserving reverence, that are both specific physical objects with documentable histories and flexible symbols onto which various meanings have been projected and through which various causes have been advanced. The crack itself, whatever its precise origins and whatever meanings we invest in it, remains a material fact, remains damage to bronze that can be examined and analyzed, remains evidence of how bells fail and why they fail, and what happens to metal when it is subjected to repeated stress over long periods. The crack tells a story about materials and forces, about design and use, about the relationship between form and function, about how objects age and deteriorate, about the limits of durability, about the inevitable victory of entropy over structure, about how even carefully made things eventually fail, eventually show their flaws, eventually crack under the accumulated weight of time and use and stress. But the crack also tells stories about meaning and symbolism, about how Americans have understood their democracy, about how they have grappled with the gap between ideals and reality, about how they have used this broken bell to represent their broken but enduring republic, about how they have found in the crack a metaphor for national imperfection, about how they have made the bell's inability to ring into an eloquent silence, into a form of speech more powerful than sound, into a proclamation that continues precisely because it cannot be completed, precisely because the bell cannot ring, precisely because the promise remains unfulfilled, precisely because liberty has not yet been proclaimed to all inhabitants, precisely because the work remains ongoing, remains necessary, remains the responsibility of each generation. The crack is both physical fact and symbolic meaning, is both damage to be conserved and feature to be preserved, is both evidence of failure and mark of authenticity, is both flaw and perfection, is both what makes the bell broken and what makes it beautiful, both what silenced it and what made it speak,
both what ended its functional life and what began its symbolic life, both what it is and what it means, both bronze fractured by stress and democracy fractured by contradiction, both material reality and metaphorical truth, both the thing itself and the idea of the thing, both what we can measure and what we can only feel, both what science explains and what only story can convey, both what happened and what it means that it happened, both history and memory, both fact and myth, both the Liberty Bell's crack and the crack in liberty, both what damages the bell and what the bell tells us about damage, both the specific fracture in this specific piece of bronze and the universal truth about imperfection and endurance and the relationship between the two, about how things that are broken can still be whole, about how silence can speak, about how what cannot ring can still proclaim, can still call, can still summon us toward ideals we have not achieved, toward promises we have not kept, toward liberty we have not delivered, toward work that remains, toward cracks that need mending, toward bells that need ringing, toward proclamations that need making, toward inhabitants who need hearing, toward lands that need liberating, toward futures that need creating, toward the ongoing project of making real what has been promised, of delivering what has been proclaimed, of closing the gap between inscription and reality, between ideal and practice, between what the bell says and what the nation does, between the promise of liberty and its actual distribution, between who is included and who is excluded, between the all of all inhabitants and the sum of actual historical practice. The Liberty Bell cannot answer these questions, cannot resolve these tensions, cannot repair these contradictions. It can only stand as reminder, as symbol, as physical presence that points toward absences, as material object that represents immaterial ideals, as broken thing that proclaims wholeness, as silent instrument that speaks louder than sound, as cracked bell that rings truer than any perfect one could, that proclaims liberty more eloquently through its inability to ring than through any sound it might make, that has become perfect in its imperfection, powerful in its brokenness, eloquent in its silence, meaningful precisely because it is damaged, valuable precisely because it is flawed, important precisely because it is cracked, the Liberty Bell precisely because it is broken, because it cannot do what bells are meant to do, because it speaks through what it cannot say, because it proclaims through what it cannot sound, because it means through what it is rather than what it does, because it has become through historical and cultural and symbolic and mysterious processes exactly what we need it to be, exactly what it means, exactly what continues to call us toward better versions of ourselves and our nation, exactly what reminds us that the work is not done, that liberty has not been fully proclaimed, that cracks remain to be repaired, that promises remain to be kept, that the bell's silence is not peace but summons, not ending but beginning, not conclusion but call, not final but ongoing, not done but continuing, not complete but perpetual, the Liberty Bell hanging in its case, the crack running across its surface, the silence filling the space where sound once was, and in that silence, in that crack, in that inability to ring, the Liberty Bell continuing its work, continuing to matter, continuing to mean, continuing to proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof, continuing to call us toward that proclamation, continuing to remind us that the bell is cracked, that liberty is imperfect, that democracy is flawed, that the nation is broken, but also that the bell endures, that liberty persists, that democracy continues, that the nation survives, that what is cracked is not destroyed, that what is broken can still be whole, that what cannot ring can still proclaim, that the Liberty Bell, silent and cracked and broken and beautiful, continues to speak, continues to call, continues to proclaim, continues to be exactly what it is, continues to mean exactly what it means, continues to matter exactly as it matters, continues.
The Liberty Bell will hang in its case tomorrow, and the next day, and for all the foreseeable tomorrows after that. Visitors will come, will look, will photograph, will read the inscription, will note the crack,
We'll have their various reactions and their various thoughts. We'll take away their various meanings. We'll add their observations to the accumulated weight of attention that has made this particular bell matter, that has elevated it above all other bells, that has transformed it from object to icon, from instrument to symbol, from bronze and copper and tin to something that transcends its material composition, to something that exists as much in meaning as in matter, as much in what it represents as in what it is. And the crack will remain, will be monitored and measured and protected, will be preserved as carefully as the bell itself, will continue to be the defining feature, the thing that makes this bell the Liberty Bell, the damage that creates the meaning, the flaw that produces the power, the imperfection that achieves perfection, the break that makes whole, the silence that speaks loudest, the crack that proclaims liberty, that calls for justice, that summons each generation to the ongoing work of making real the promises proclaimed, of delivering the liberty announced, of including all the inhabitants, of repairing the cracks in democracy, of mending what is broken, of making ring what is silent, of making sound what is cracked, of making whole what is damaged, of making perfect what is flawed, of making real what is ideal, of making the Liberty Bell's proclamation true at last, making it ring at last, making it sound at last, making it whole at last, making it perfect at last, making it... But no, that is the wrong ending, the wrong conclusion, the wrong understanding of what the Liberty Bell means and what the crack signifies. The bell will not be repaired, the crack will remain, the silence will continue, and that is as it should be. That is what makes the Liberty Bell the Liberty Bell. That is what gives it power, what makes it speak, what makes it matter. The imperfection is not a problem to be solved, but a truth to be acknowledged, a reality to be accepted, a feature to be preserved. The Liberty Bell teaches us that perfection is not the goal, that wholeness is not required, that function is not essential, that what matters is meaning, is persistence, is the ongoing work of proclaiming liberty even when, especially when, that proclamation is incomplete, when liberty is imperfectly realized, when the bell is cracked and cannot ring, but speaks nonetheless, speaks precisely through its inability to ring, speaks through its brokenness, through its damage, through its imperfection, speaks the truth that democracy is cracked, that liberty is flawed, that promises are broken, that ideals are not achieved, that the work is not done, that the proclamation is not complete, that the bell cannot ring, and that this is exactly right, exactly true, exactly what we need to hear, exactly what the Liberty Bell proclaims in its silence, exactly what it means through its crack, exactly what it teaches through its imperfection, that broken things can still be whole, that damaged things can still be valuable, that cracked bells can still proclaim, that silence can speak, that imperfection is not failure, that the Liberty Bell, cracked and silent and broken and beautiful, continues its work, continues to matter, continues to mean, continues to proclaim liberty, continues to call us toward better, continues to remind us that the work continues, that the bell continues, that the crack continues, that the proclamation continues, that liberty, imperfect and incomplete and still being proclaimed, still being worked toward, still being fought for, still being made real through ongoing effort and ongoing struggle and ongoing commitment, continues, 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 as the Liberty Bell continues, as the crack continues, as the silence continues to speak, continues to proclaim, continues to call, continues to summon, continues to matter, continues to mean, continues to be the Liberty Bell, cracked, silent, broken, beautiful, imperfect, perfect, unable to ring, unable to stop proclaiming, unable to be anything other than what it is, the Liberty Bell, now and forever, cracked and whole, silent and speaking,
broken and enduring, imperfect and invaluable, proclaiming liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof, still proclaiming, always proclaiming, forever proclaiming, in silence, in brokenness, in imperfection, in truth. The weight of what the Liberty Bell carries, not just the physical weight of its bronze, measurable in tons, but the symbolic weight of meaning accumulated over centuries, presses down through time with increasing force. Each generation adds to this weight, layers new interpretations onto old ones, finds in the bell's silence new reasons to listen, discovers in its crack new lessons about resilience and fragility, about what endures and what breaks, about the relationship between material and meaning, between substance and symbol, between what a thing is made of and what it stands for. Consider how many hands have touched this bell, how many eyes have gazed upon it, how many minds have contemplated its surface and its crack and its inscription, from the founders who cast it to the workers who hung it, from the legislators who heard it ring to the citizens who marked their days by its sound, from the revolutionaries who hid it to the abolitionists who claimed it, from the craftsmen who drilled holes to stop the crack from spreading, to the conservators who monitor it today, from the millions of visitors who have stood before it to the millions more that will come. This accumulated human attention is itself remarkable, is a phenomenon worth contemplating, tells us something about what humans need from objects, what we require from symbols, why we invest particular things with significance that transcends their material nature. The Liberty Bell could have been just another colonial-era bell, could have been melted down during one of America's wars when bronze was needed for cannons, could have been replaced when it cracked and then forgotten, could have survived as a curiosity but not as an icon, could have remained in obscurity while some other object became the symbol of American liberty and democratic ideals. But that it became what it became was not inevitable, was the result of specific choices and specific accidents, specific historical processes that could have unfolded differently, that in another timeline might have elevated a different object to similar status, that might have left the State House bell as nothing more than a footnote in the history of American metalwork, a minor example of colonial-era bell founding, interesting to specialists but unknown to the general public. But in this timeline, in our actual history, the bell was claimed by abolitionists, was adopted as a symbol of freedom movements, was preserved and protected and displayed and discussed, was invested with meanings that accumulated and reinforced each other, was made central to American civic religion, to the quasi-sacred narrative of American exceptionalism and American progress toward ever-expanding liberty, to the story Americans tell themselves about who they are and what they stand for and what makes them distinct among nations. And the crack appearing at the right moment made the bell even more powerful as a symbol, made it vulnerable and therefore precious, made it incapable of functioning and therefore freed it to mean, transformed it from working instrument into preserved relic, from useful object to sacred artifact.
This transformation from functional to symbolic, from working to preserved, from useful to meaningful, is itself instructive, tells us something about how symbols work, about what they require, about why things that cannot function practically can be more powerful symbolically than things that work perfectly. A bell that rings is just a bell, is doing what bells do, is ordinary in its function, however excellent its tone or impressive its size. But a bell that cannot ring, that is broken and therefore silent, that speaks only through its presence and its history and the meanings invested in it, this is something different, something that escapes the category of mere tool or instrument, something that exists primarily as symbol, that has no practical function to interfere with its symbolic work, that can be whatever we need it to be, precisely because it cannot be what it was designed to be. The Liberty Bell, in this sense, is more free in its brokenness than it was in its wholeness, more eloquent in its silence than it was in its sound, more powerful as symbol than it ever was as bell.
The crack liberated it, freed it from function, allowed it to transcend utility and become pure meaning, pure symbol, pure presence. And we, in preserving it in this broken state, in refusing to repair it, in celebrating rather than lamenting its crack, have acknowledged this truth, have recognized that the bell's value now lies not in its ability to ring, but in its inability to do so. Not in what it can do, but in what it means. Not in its material properties, but in its symbolic significance. This embrace of brokenness, this valorization of the crack, this finding of perfection in imperfection speaks to something deep in the American character, or at least in the American self-conception. America sees itself as an experiment, as unfinished, as striving toward ideals not yet achieved, as cracked but enduring, as imperfect but committed to improvement, as a work in progress rather than a completed project. The Liberty Bell, broken but not destroyed, cracked but still whole, unable to ring but still proclaiming, fits this self-conception perfectly, embodies it in bronze, makes it tangible and visible, provides a material symbol for an immaterial understanding of national identity. Other nations might have demanded perfection in their symbols, might have insisted on repair or replacement, might have been unable to tolerate a cracked bell as a national icon, might have seen the damage as shameful rather than meaningful, as something to be hidden rather than displayed, as evidence of failure rather than as mark of authenticity. But America, or at least the America that has preserved and celebrated the Liberty Bell, has chosen differently, has embraced the crack, has made imperfections central to the symbol rather than peripheral to it, has decided that this broken bell represents the nation better than any perfect one could, speaks more truly about American reality than any idealized symbol ever would. This is not to say that all Americans agree with this interpretation, that there is consensus about what the Liberty Bell means, or whether its brokenness is valuable or lamentable, whether its crack should be seen as badge of honor or as evidence of failure. The bell means different things to different people, serves different symbolic purposes for different constituencies, can be claimed by those celebrating American achievement and by those critiquing American failures, can represent both pride and shame, both accomplishment and shortcoming, both what America is and what it is not, both fulfilled promises and broken ones. This multiplicity of meaning is not weakness but strength, is what allows the bell to remain vital, to avoid becoming a dead symbol whose significance is fixed and whose relevance is purely historical, whose only function is to commemorate a past that is disconnected from present concerns. The Liberty Bell lives because it can be argued over, can be interpreted differently, can be made to speak to contemporary issues and contemporary struggles, can be a site of contest rather than consensus, can be something that different Americans understand differently while still recognizing it as important, as worth arguing about, as carrying weight that justifies the effort of interpretation and reinterpretation. The crack, in this sense, enables the argument, provides the physical feature that can be read multiple ways, that different interpreters can emphasize or de-emphasize, that can be made to mean different things depending on what questions are asked of it, what context it is placed in, what narrative frame is used to understand it. Is the crack a warning about fragility, about how easily democratic institutions can break, about how close we always are to catastrophic failure? Or is it reassurance about resilience, about how even broken things can endure, about how damage does not necessarily mean destruction, about how cracked bells can still proclaim? Both readings are valid, both find support in the bell's physical reality and in its historical significance. Both can be argued for with conviction and with evidence. Both resonate with some Americans' understanding of their nation and their democracy. The crack is thus not just a physical feature, but a hermeneutical opportunity,
a place where interpretation can happen, where meaning can be made and remade, where each generation can find what it needs, where the bell can be made to speak to contemporary concerns while maintaining continuity with its past, where new meanings can be layered onto old ones without completely displacing them, where the Liberty Bell can be both historical artifact and living symbol, both fixed in its physical form and fluid in its significance, both the specific object that Pass and Stowe cast in 1753 and the idea of the Liberty Bell that exists in American consciousness and that is far larger than any single object could be, that encompasses all the meanings and all the interpretations and all the uses to which the bell has been put across more than 2.5 centuries. The future of the Liberty Bell, both the physical object and the symbol, depends on continued care and continued engagement, on future generations finding it valuable enough to preserve and meaningful enough to interpret, on it continuing to speak to concerns and to embody values that matter to Americans, on it remaining more than just a historical curiosity, more than just an old bell that is interesting to specialists but irrelevant to broader public concerns, more than just a tourist attraction that people visit out of obligation or habit, rather than from genuine interest or emotional engagement. There are no guarantees of this continued relevance, no assurance that future Americans will care about the Liberty Bell as much as present and past Americans have, no certainty that its brokenness will be maintained across future generations and future historical developments that we cannot predict or imagine. Symbols can lose their power, can become dead metaphors, can shift from living presence to historical artifact, can become things that are preserved because they were important rather than because they are important, can become relics of past significance rather than sources of present meaning. But the Liberty Bell has shown remarkable durability, not just in its bronze, but in its significance, has maintained relevance across dramatic changes in American society and American politics, has been claimed by successive movements and successive generations, has proven adaptable enough to speak to different concerns without losing its essential identity, has remained recognizable across all its reinterpretations, has endured not just physically but symbolically, has demonstrated that it can carry new meanings without collapsing under their weight, can be made to speak to new questions without losing its connection to old answers.
This durability suggests that the Liberty Bell will continue to matter, will continue to be preserved and displayed and interpreted, will continue to draw visitors and generate scholarship and inspire arguments, will continue to be the Liberty Bell in all its complexity and contradiction, in all its physical reality and symbolic significance, in all its cracked imperfection and meaningful wholeness, will continue to hang in its case and speak through its silence and proclaim through its brokenness, will continue to be what it has become through historical accident and deliberate choice and accumulated interpretation, the symbol of American liberty, flawed and enduring, broken and whole, silent and eloquent, cracked and complete, the Liberty Bell, now and for the foreseeable future, proclaiming liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof, proclaiming it through presence rather than through sound, through meaning rather than through function, through what it is rather than what it does, through the crack that runs across its surface and that has become, mysteriously but undeniably, what makes the bell speak, what makes it matter, what makes it the Liberty Bell. The bell will hang tomorrow, the crack will remain, the visitors will come, the arguments will continue, the meanings will accumulate, the Liberty Bell will endure, will persist, will continue its silent proclamation,
will continue to call us toward ideals we have not achieved, toward promises we have not kept, toward liberty we have not delivered, toward the ongoing work of making real what has been proclaimed, of closing the gap between inscription and reality, of fulfilling the promise that is engraved in bronze but not yet fully realized in practice, of proclaiming liberty not just in words but in deeds, not just on bells but in lives, not just as ideal but as reality, not just for some inhabitants but for all, truly all, completely all. The liberty that the bell proclaims and that we, generation after generation, continue to work toward, continue to struggle for, continue to make more real, even as we recognize how far we remain from its full realization, how wide the gap still is, how much work remains, how the bell's crack reminds us that our democracy is cracked too, that our liberty is imperfect too, that our proclamations exceed our achievements too, that we are all, bell and nation alike, broken but enduring, damaged but persistent, imperfect but still proclaiming, still calling, still summoning each generation to the work of repair, to the labor of making whole, to the ongoing project of American democracy, imperfect and cracked but not destroyed, damaged but not defeated, broken but not beyond repair, silent but not beyond speech, the Liberty Bell and the nation it represents, both cracked, both enduring, both proclaiming liberty, both calling us forward, both summoning us toward better, both imperfect, both precious, both broken, both beautiful, both continuing to speak, to call, to proclaim, to matter, to mean, to be the Liberty Bell, cracked and whole, silent and speaking, broken and beautiful, forever proclaiming liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof.